It's okay to suck at Final Fantasy XIV. You see all those perfectly optimized openers and rotations with the pristinely perfected stat lines, down to the detail that you might even want to race change just to have the best build. You see the savage races, you see the ultimate races, and people aiming higher and higher with their passes. But all of this is optional. Coming from other MMOs, this can be tough to realize, but when the so-called Gearing Treadmill is mostly trivialized, and the amount of time you can feasibly invest in gearing every week is heavily limited, we move from an environment where you need to hurry through content, because every hour, every minute, and even every second of your playtime could result in a gear upgrade, to an environment where, ultimately, a fixed amount of content can be used to upgrade your gear, and even if you did, a raid tier lasts only 8 months. And a new raid tier is heralded by making most of the previous raid tier's gear immediately obsolete with the introduction of crafted gear that beats it. This means that your motivation to get the best gear in the game, to push your character to its limits, is inspiring, but ultimately the content you would need this for is typically contained in the raid tier that the gear is found in. This means that there is no expectation or requirement to continuously get stronger and stronger to be able to do content in the game. Compare this to an MMO like World of Warcraft, retail or classic, you choose. An MMO where there is so much content that can feasibly improve your gear that you can hardly do all of it before the week or day resets and you can do it all again. If you only have 4 hours in a day to do as much as you can, and admittedly not everyone has even that, then someone in your party being bad at the game directly affects your ability to improve your gear, and so your ability to find groups in the future, and so your ability to play the game, having fun. By extension, the other player sucking is causing you to have less enjoyment down the line, and falling behind the Gearing Treadmill can have instantaneous and brutal effects for the individual player, especially if they depend on group finder tools to play. These kinds of Gearing Treadmills, which by the way are not necessarily limited to World of Warcraft, can be so overarching and all-consuming in player attention that, as you could feasibly spend every waking moment on the treadmill, then why would you do anything in the game that doesn't offer a potential gear upgrade? Why should I do this reputation grind if it doesn't offer me any gear upgrades? And in contrast, now that you added a gear upgrade to this reputation, I am forced to do it to stay competitive. Naturally, there are players in any MMO that simply don't participate much in the Gearing Treadmill. For example, it is not surprising that there is a significant amount of the World of Warcraft player base that just do old content, to farm mounts and gear to adjust their looks, transmogs as it is called. However, when old content stays difficult for too long, this causes problems for these players too, as old content continues to have weekly logouts. Every week you can't beat a boss for the potential mount drop is an opportunity lost that you will never get back. Ultimately, these sort of casual players can also end up in this stressful every second counts mentality. Now, before I continue, I just want to point out that I'm not trying to say that one game is better than another. However, knowing these comparisons may make it easier to understand why Final Fantasy XIV has such a different effect on, well, at least the majority of the player base. Let's start with the glamour collecting and mount farming example. In Final Fantasy XIV, one's gear is outdated and no longer the current raid tier. The weekly logout on the content is removed. So fast, in fact, that typically the weekly logout is removed with the release of the next raid tier, if not in the last few weeks of the raid tier itself. Additionally, a lot of content is released without a weekly logout at all. Granted, content stays difficult for far longer, with content from Stormblood 2 expansions ago, still often requiring multiple players to defeat in time. Now, you might say that this is related to the stat squish that happened with Endwalker. But as far as I know, the buffs that boost your damage and so on when you enter this old content is adjusted to a point where the difference is negligible. O12S of Stormblood is easier in Endwalker than it was in Shadowbringers, so this ain't it. As such, the kind of difficult content a casual player might be doing a lot is solved. You don't have to hurry, there is no weekly logout, so once you figure out the fight, you can farm it to your heart's content. The fights being non-trivial also means the content stays relevant for longer. For the Gearing Treadmill, on the other hand, Final Fantasy XIV also solves this by making it heavily limited what you can do. I mentioned this vaguely earlier, but here's the deal. When a raid tier is released, all the crafter jobs get access to craft a new set of combat gear that happens to be 10 item levels above whatever the previous raid tier dropped. 10 item levels better than the best gear in the game at the time. This means that if you want to participate in the upcoming raid tier, you can have competitive gear to use by simply buying or crafting a gear set when it comes out, and then you're caught up. This means that every raid tier becomes its own closed system. You don't need anything from the previous tier to participate, so you don't have to be on the treadmill all the time to not fall behind. Next, the game also has a weekly capped currency that can be used to buy gear that is an additional 10 item levels stronger than the crafted gear. This means that whether you raid or not, you have something to strive for. In terms of raiding itself, any given raid tier launches with one extreme encounter, which can be spammed as much as you like, to get a weapon slightly better than the crafted ones. And then there are 4 savage raid boss fights with a weekly logout, offering gear that is 20 item levels higher than the crafted gear and is, in fact, the best gear in the game at the time. That's it, there is no more on the Gearing Treadmill. And given that the best gear drops from the hardest content in the game, at least at that time, your only motivation to get this gear is to do this same content more easily, or prepare for an ultimate. In other words, you don't need this gear if you aren't actually doing the content anyway. Your motivation to get the gear from Savage content is to do Savage content in the first place. So really, only the players that enjoy this will feel obligated to do it. But you wanted to do it anyway, right? A concern that may appear about this is that to start raiding in a raid tier like, say, halfway through the raid tier, players will probably require significantly better gear to get in, right? When you've had months to collect the weekly currency gear, eventually it becomes expected that you have it. Halfway through a raid tier, precisely halfway through, certain options get enabled for that raid tier. Crafted gear can be upgraded to gain 10 additional item levels, meaning that you will only be 10 item levels behind the best gear in the game, with just crafted gear. An Alliance raid is added to the game which also drops gear of this item level, although, given the ease of which you can collect crafted gear of that power level, the Alliance raid drops are more viewed as glamour. But these Alliance raids also allow you to upgrade one of those weekly currency gear pieces 10 more item levels, one per week. This means you could feasibly get gear at the highest attainable item level simply by playing what is considered casual content, so the best gear never stays completely out of reach from players. As the expectation of gear increases, the minimum easily attainable gear also increases. And of course, another extreme encounter is added that offers a weapon that is slightly stronger too. And finally, as weapons tend to be the most complicated to get better options for, the relic weapons of Final Fantasy XIV are used as a catch-up system to get a decent weapon throughout a raid tier. Although they also stay slightly behind the best weapons in the game throughout the majority of an expansion. Anyway, this is a long-winded way to say that you have a lot of options to get gear without being a hardcore raider. And even if you are a hardcore raider, the main motivation you have for getting the best gear in the game is either because you like to see big damage numbers, or to be geared for whatever comes next, which would be an ultimate encounter, which is even harder than Savage. This means that if you aren't doing Savage, then you don't need the Savage gear for anything anyway. And the amount of content you can do to gear up is so limited that aside from the time you need to master a fight, it only takes so many hours to exhaust all of your weekly options. So why is it that it is okay to suck at Final Fantasy XIV? Because the casual content in Final Fantasy XIV is easy enough that it is approachable by most anyone. And better players can compensate for the worse players quite handily. And, more importantly, the more hardcore players are not stressed out by having a ticking clock over their head all the time. So these players are much less likely to take issue with content taking a bit longer sometimes. An additional benefit of the Gear Treadmill being so laid back in Final Fantasy XIV is that players actually have time to do things in the game that don't award gear upgrades, or gear, or anything at all actually. Players have time to hang out and work on a personal house or apartment, which technically loses you money more so than gain, which could have been used on gear. Players have time to just hang out and talk with friends without feeling like they should be doing something more useful. Now, just because there's nothing stressing or calling you in the game to hurry up, that doesn't mean you can't put in effort to try your best for the sake of getting things done faster. But there is a huge difference between needing to improve because otherwise you can't participate at all, and wanting to improve because you want to get better at a game you enjoy. And of course, as other people are involved, playing poorly just because you are lazy is still considered rude. No need to waste other people's time just because you can. But having the ability to let less skilled players participate in content just as much as the better players is a good thing. Remember that unless the player explicitly stated why they play the way they do, you won't know for certain. You can't know if the reason why the player is a little slow on dodging things and takes a while to cast their spells is because they are not as well acquainted with video games, or maybe have some sort of disability preventing them from doing better. So remember to try and give your fellow player the benefit of the doubt, and remember that it is okay to suck at Final Fantasy XIV. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can like the video, leave a comment, subscribe and hit the bell to get notified when next I post a video. If you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel. Fun fact, every expansion to date has had a total of 4 different tomestones throughout their life cycles. Incidentally, the elegant tombstone of Poetics, commonly used to buy gear from old content, was the final tombstone of A Realm Reborn. Not to be confused with the elegant tombstone of Soldiery, which had an incredibly similar icon but was the tombstone that preceded Poetics.